Hey, what's up you guys? Jake Sanders here on the Beefy Built YouTube channel, and today we're going to be working on my buddy Tanner's lifted CRV. We're going to be doing a 2-inch subframe drop kit on it that I produce. We're also going to be installing some upper control arms that we're going to flip like I've talked about previously. And we're also going to be fleshing out the rear diff to get rid of that awful diff howl that everyone comes across once they get one of these. So let's get to it. So we got a 99 5-speed all-wheel drive CRV with a 235 75 15 on it. He's got an Aerogenics 1-inch spacer up front with some aftermarket springs and struts with the adjustable upper ball joints. Out back he's got the Aerogenic spacers with aftermarket springs again with an adjustable camber arm. We're going to be doing a trailing arm spacer down there. We're also going to be adding in the subframe drop on the rear subframe along with the engine and everything, which should get these axles back to being level and it should drive like a normal car again. Figured I'd go over the kit and everything that goes along with it. You got your extended steering shaft that comes with it. You got your engine spacers, which still need to be painted for his car. And then you have your spacers for the subframe, which are 2x2 box steel with the sleeve welded in the center to protect the bolt from the elements and also give it some more structural integrity so it doesn't bow out when you tighten it down. And of course all the necessary hardware to make it all work. So let's get to it. So now while we wait for those to dry, we're going to start getting into the engine and getting things out of the way so we can get to where we need to be to put the spacers on. So we're in the middle of getting the driver's side motor mount off, but the upper bolt right here is a little rusty, so we're soaking that in some PV Blaster right now. What you got to do on this side is get these bolts off, get this bracket out of the way, and then we'll be removing those 2 studs right there to replace with longer bolts so the spacers fit properly. It helps to grab this line and just kind of gently bend it out of the way so you can get to those 2 side mount bolts pretty easily. But while we're waiting on that PV Blaster to soak in, we're going to go ahead and move to the passenger side, get this 1 stud removed on this side and these 2 bolts, and then we will install the longer bolts to install the spacers. So now that we got all of the bolts and studs removed on this side, we're going to go ahead and remove this mount. Well, the mount bracket, I should say. And, oh, it already had a little bit of an engine drop kit on it. What do you know? Shout out to Honda Rescue Garage. So, we're going to be removing this stud now, and we'll be putting longer bolts in all 3 spots along with the 2-inch spacers that are finishing up drying right there. So the way I typically like to go about removing these studs is I'll grab 2 nuts, same thread pitch as the OEM one, and I will thread one of them upside down onto the stud with my ratcheting wrench. And then once that one's pretty close to the bottom and I have enough threads to get the other one on, I'll take the other one and I'll put it on the correct way. And then I'll come back in with my gun. Actually, I'll just use the ratchet. And I will tighten the top one onto the bottom one to ensure that they are sandwiched together. And then the stud will be the one that comes out when I start to loosen the bottom. Now that they're tightened down together, I should be able to take this ratchet and loosen the whole stud out as basically a nut or a bolt. We have the studs removed. We're going to come over here to our engine drop bolts. Grab some of those. Grab the bracket. Set the bracket back into place where it should be. Now that we have the bracket back into place, we can go ahead and... I'm only going to do 2 bolts for right now because we're going to install the bolts first. And then once we have the engine hanging where it's supposed to be at, we'll go back, remove each bolt individually, and install each spacer individually. Grab the engine mount bolt, raise this back up into place. Be sure to support the engine and transmission. I have a jack and jack stand underneath them right now to support them so they don't drop as soon as you undo all the bolts. And now that side is ready to go. We'll go ahead and move on to the torque mount. Alright, so now that we have both of our torque mount bolts removed and the torque mount is hanging down just a slight amount, we're going to go up here, leave these up here, and we'll grab 2 of our drive shaft carrier bolts, and we're going to come down here and install these with no spacers just like we did up top, just so the engine can hang on the bolts and we can line it up afterwards. And then after all of the bolts are in, we'll go back one by one and install each spacer. So we got the longer bolts installed on both front torque mounts. We got the longer bolts installed on the passenger side motor mount. Torque mount bolts are down there too. Now we're going to go ahead and start working on getting this one done again. Hopefully the PB blaster is soaked in long enough to help me get that bolt off that mount right there. Alright, so we got that bolt removed off the top of that motor mount. Had a little bit of rust on it, but it came out alright after a little bit of PB blaster. So now we're going to remove this bracket right here. We're going to remove the previously installed engine spacers from Honda Rescue Garage. Put it over there. And then we're going to do the same process to remove the studs on this side that we did on the passenger side, which is stacking one nut upside down, tightening the other one onto it, and then loosening the bottom one to pull the stud out. We've gone ahead and we've got every single stud that needs to be removed taken out. This side is ready to accept the new bolts that are longer, so we'll go ahead and grab those. Set those right here. Grab the bracket for the engine mount. Go ahead and drop that on. And go ahead and thread in the bolts to support the engine, and we will put the spacers in later, like I had said. Alright, so the next thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be removing the 10mm that goes here and 10mm that goes here for your OEM steering shaft, because it won't be long enough once we drop the subframe. So we'll go ahead and get those out of the way. That you have both the steering shaft bolts removed. You can't just loosen them, you have to remove them. You just grab onto it, wiggle as hard as you possibly can, and pull up and towards the steering column. That way it slides up on the steering shaft. You can pull it off the steering rack and then move it away from the steering rack, slide it down, and completely remove it. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and start working on getting the subframe drop down. Now that all the engine bolts are in and the engine is standing on the jack and jack stand, we're going to go ahead and start removing this bolt here, and this bolt over here. There's also one more up in the front of the subframe right up here. I'm gonna go ahead and get all those out and replace them with the longer bolts to let it hang down. And then we'll go ahead and slide the spacers in. Alright, now we're getting to the part where we're about to drop the subframe and the transmission and engine all down. We need to look at all of these stressed out wires and go ahead and move them out of the way. So we're going to start off with this one. We're just going to undo it from its clip right here on the side. And then, it's kind of hard to do one-handed. And we're just going to let that hang instead. And that'll relieve the slack off that we need. We also have this one down here. All we're going to do is do the same thing to the clip down here. Pull it off, let it hang. That way it can relieve some of the slack and the tension that's on there. And then there's this one over here on this side. Again, just undo the clip, slide it off. And that way it has tension. Or slack, sorry. I also like to get this wire down here. There's another tab down there that I like to just do the same thing with, where you just pry back the locking tab and then you can get the connector on it. And it'll give it some slack. So there you go. Now that we have the subframe hanging and everything, we're gonna go ahead and support the engine. This side motor mount back up a little bit. That way we can take the stress off of it, so we can take the bolt out one by one, replace it with the spacer, and reinstall the bolt. Tighten everything down on that side. Then we'll do the same with the passenger side, then the torque knots. So now that we have these spacers installed and tightened down on both the top mounts, we're going to go ahead and move to the torque mounts. We're going to go ahead and grab the two bolts out of the drive shaft carrier bearing. We're going to put the longer ones in and let that hang for now. We're going to go ahead and get this drive shaft loop off so the drive shaft can hang down and not get in the way, or not be hung up by this. We're going to go ahead and get the 2-inch spacer and the bolt installed on the passenger side of the front of the subframe. Alright, so now that we got the front engine spacers in on both sides, and we got the subframe drop in on the front side, and the drive shaft is still hanging, we're going to go ahead and move on to the rear subframe and diff and go ahead and get those dropped. And then once we get all of those dropped, we'll go back through, torque everything down, and go ahead and get our steering shaft reinstalled. So now that we got the two bolts on either side of the rear subframe, with the front one still holding the rear of the subframe in, we're going to go ahead and undo the front subframe bolts right there on either side. Now we got all of our drop bolts in and the subframe is hanging by the bolts. So now we'll go back, remove each bolt individually and replace it with the spacer. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and remove both the drive shaft carrier bearing bolts and install the spacers and then reinstall the bolts. So now that we have our engine spacers all in, we have our subframe spacers in front and rear. We've spaced out the drive shaft. Now we're going to go ahead and remove the current 1-inch trailing arm spacers and install the 2-inch trailing arm spacers and the longer bolts. So now we're going to jack up the rear subframe, and that bolt with the trailing arm in it should drop down once we jack up the back end of the car. And when you do this, go ahead and check all of your brake lines and be sure they have enough flex to them, so when you're at full articulation you aren't stretching brake lines. Like this one right here is at the end of its travel, so we're going to go ahead and move the brake line up to relieve some of the stress, which I'll show you in a second. So the reason for doing the rear trailing arm spacer is the way a trailing arm works. The more you swing down the suspension by giving it more lift, you pivot off this front point, which then swings the tire forward and down at the same time, pushing it much closer to this rear arch next to your door. So you space out the trailing arm, bringing that pivot point back down to basically recenter the wheel. Alright, so now that we have the trailing arm spacer on and the rear end of the car supported, we're going to go ahead and take off the wheel so we can relocate the brake line bracket so it doesn't have so much tension on it when it's fully flexed out. Now that we have the wheel off, we can see what the rear brake line setup looks like. We have this line right here, which has a lot of tension on it. We have these two bolts right here, which if you go onto the back side of the trailing arm, you can see the bracket that these two bolts go to, which has a hard line that goes to the drum and the soft line that goes up. So we're going to take these two bolts out, we're going to drill a hole up here, and then we're going to re-bolt it. Alright, so now you're going to want to find about where you want the line to sit. There looks about good for me. So I'm going to go ahead and put my screwdriver or a punch, whatever you have there. Go ahead and mark it real quick. Then grab your drill, or a drill bit about the same size as the bolt, and then you're going to go ahead and just drill yourself a hole right there. Now that we have the driver's side, or the passenger side, and the driver's side brake lines relocated on the rear end, we're going to go ahead and put the rear tires back on. We're going to set the car back on the ground, and we're going to start focusing on the front end. Trick I like to do to be sure that the steering wheel stays completely straight during all of this is I put the seat belt through the steering wheel and I buckle it in so it cannot move. So now that we have the rear end finished up, we're going to go ahead and start focusing on getting our steering shaft back in. Here's the OEM one compared to the extended one that goes with the 2-inch subframe drop kit. So we'll go ahead and get that installed. After fighting with the steering shaft for about 20 minutes, I finally remembered that there was a little trick that I had. I would drop the subframe back down on the driver's side to allow the steering shaft to line up better. Also, there is a boot inside here that you might have to rip so you can and tear out so this thing can have enough movement down to get to where the steering rack is now currently at. So now that the extended steering shaft is slid all the way up on the steering column, you're going to go ahead and be sure that your steering wheel is completely straight along with your wheels, and you're going to fold this part over onto the steering rack, and you're going to push down, slide it onto it, and then put the bolts back in and tighten them up. Alright, so I went ahead and got the steering shaft all on and tightened up. You can see down there. And I got the subframe all tightened back up and torqued back down. Now we're going to go ahead and unbox these control arms right there, get the front end jacked up, and replace these upper control arms with some flip true harts. Got our box of true hart upper control arms. The way that we're going to go about this is these are typically meant to sit like this. So they'll sit on either side like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take both of them, we're going to flip them upside down, and we're going to take this ball joint, take it off, put it on this side under here, and take this plate and put it on top. You have all the bolts removed and the ball joint flipped, you're going to realize that this plate doesn't sit inside of here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a grinder, we're just going to shave down a little bit of the edge on each side, and then we'll be able to install it. So now that you have both of your plates cut away and trimmed down, you go ahead and slide those into the top section, well technically the bottom section of the control arm, and make sure that they slide freely so when you go to adjust your camber you don't have any binding because of those. And then you go ahead and just reassemble. So now that the arms are flipped on both sides, we're going to go ahead and jack up the front end and get the bolts loosened up for the upper control arms, which are here, back here, here, and on the other side back there. Alright, so now we have the flip true hart installed on the passenger side as well. And you can see that I left the bushings completely loose on the upper control arm. Because what we're going to do is we're going to get this all bolted up together. We're going to load up the suspension at ride height, and then we will then tighten down the bolts up top to make sure that the bushings are not stressed out in a weird way, which would cause them to tear prematurely. Alright, now we're going to go ahead, we're going to take our jack, we're going to put our jack underneath the lower control arm, and we're not going to completely flex it out on this side, we're just going to load it up so the suspension has pressure on it, and it's not free floating. You don't need to completely go all the way and flex it all the way out, you're trying to find the center. So now we're probably about where ride height would be, so we're gonna go ahead and tighten down everything and then tighten down the bushings and we'll be good to go. So now we got one last thing to do underneath the car, which is, if you can see right there, the drive shaft is touching the exhaust, so we're going to remove the OEM exhaust hanger and replace it with a longer one in the center. Now that we have the longer exhaust hanger installed on the center, the exhaust has just enough room to not hit the drive shaft, so we're good there. Now for the last thing, we're going to be installing the drive shaft loop on the front end with spacers to hang it down below the drive shaft so it doesn't hit. And after that, we'll do our final bolt check and we'll be good. Guys, that's going to do it for today's video of getting the 2-inch subframe drop installed on Tanner's CR-V. I'm going to be doing a rear diff flush on it to get rid of the howl and help better engagement like we all have issues with when we first get these. But I'll be doing that in a later video because this video already got a little bit longer than I had planned on it being. So I'll catch you guys later. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. If you have any questions about the 2-inch subframe drop or anything else regarding lifting CR-Vs, go ahead and leave it in the comments and I'll get back to it as quickly as I can. Thanks, take care guys.